Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. Now, if you're not driving right now, if you're at home watching this, or you're even at work, it's fine. If you're at work, it'll be our secret. But if you're somewhere safe, I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Close them. Are they closed? Close them. And I want you to imagine driving down a very dark, rural road late at night. Then suddenly, you come upon a car completely on fire on the side of the road. It's crashed into an embankment. It's engulfed in flames in the middle of nowhere. So, you grab your phone, you call the police. When they arrive at the scene, they find a body in that car that is so completely destroyed by the fire that it's next to impossible to know who for sure this person even was. I mean, where do you even go from there, right? You need to figure out who that person was, how they ended up like that. Was this an accident? Could this have been a homicide? Well, what's the deal? You can open your eyes now. So grab your comfy socks, grab your cocktail, grab your water, grab your Stanley, grab whatever it is that makes you feel the warm and fuzzies, and sit back because we have got a lot to talk about. This case is different from the usual ones that I cover, and all I'm going to say, because I don't want to give anything away, is that you are going to be left speechless. It's got a twist in it. It's got a turn. You're going to want to listen till the end. And really quick, hit subscribe. Hit subscribe even if you're new here, even if you're old here. YouTube unsubscribes people from me all the time. Subscribe so that you don't miss future episodes. And let's get into it. One of the questions I feel like I get asked quite a bit is how I manage it all. I have 2 toddlers at home. I record and work full time. I have my husband. I have friendships. And I'm going to just be honest with you guys because I feel like I keep it real with you. I don't do it all. I have a really difficult time managing everything that's going on in my life. My relationships, motherhood, working, friendships. I feel like I definitely am not as present and as good as a friend as I should be. I need to pour more into those friendships. So sometimes when I feel like I need to just reset or recalibrate, I'll talk with my therapist. They help ground me. They help me realize what my priorities should be, how I can really focus in on certain relationships and making things better and feeling balanced really with everything that I'm juggling. And I've started using BetterHelp, which has been so helpful for me and also happens to be today's sponsor. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is really trained to listen and help you and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site and you can use my link, betterhelp.com/10tolife. You answer a few questions and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people who are struggling with things just like you are. You'll be matched with a therapist usually within the first 48 hours, so you can get started really fast. And what I love about it is you can call with your phone, you can use your computer, you can video chat, you can message, whatever makes you feel the most comfortable. So it is the easiest possible way to start talking with a therapist. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/10tolife or choose 10 to life during sign up, and you'll enjoy a special discount on your first month. It has helped me tremendously, and I hope it will help you as well. In 2004, 20-year-old Molly Daniels was a young mother of 2 from a town north of Austin in Texas. She had shoulder-length brown hair, thin eyebrows, wore glasses. She worked as a receptionist for a home remodeling company, and she was known to be very kind to everybody around her. She was also known to be a very good, attentive mother to her kids. Molly was married to a 23-year-old named Clayton Daniels, who went by the name Clay for short. Clay had sandy brownish blonde hair. He usually kept it pretty short. Also usually had a goatee or a thin beard along with a pretty big mole on his chin. I'm just trying to illustrate it, guys. I'm just trying to tell you. So they had met when Molly was just a teenager. She went to a bar, they hit it off right away, and they stayed together for years. Now they had 2 children, a 4-year-old son named Caleb, who was from Molly's different relationship, and then a 1-year-old daughter named Harley, who Molly and Clay had together. Clay treated both of these kids like they were his own, and Caleb called Clay dad. They really were such a loving family, and one of Molly and Clay's absolute favorite things to do together was go riding on Clay's motorcycle. Motorcycles were basically Clay's entire life. He was on a bike as much as he possibly could be. He had the whole biker getup as well, including a leather jacket, a silver chain. I mean, he even named his daughter Harley, so you can imagine how big of a deal motorcycles were to him. He had been an auto mechanic in the past, but by 2004, he didn't end up having a job. He stayed home, and he took care of Caleb and Harley while Molly was out working. He just, for one reason or another, struggled to find a job that worked for him. They all lived in Leander, Texas, which is about 22 miles northwest of Austin. And the Leander that exists today is not like the Leander that they lived in back then. I mean, back then it was a lot smaller. In the past few years, it's grown a ton, and it now has a population of about 74,000 people. But it's a quiet suburban area, and it's also not too far from the city, which is nice, but it also means that you get all the downsides of quiet suburban life, like judgy neighbors. See, not everybody approved of Molly and Clay's relationship. Molly's own mother thought that she could do better, but she also wasn't going to step in and interfere with her daughter's life, especially since Molly and Clay had a daughter together. She didn't want her grandchildren to be stuck without a dad, but she kind of looked at Clay almost like a loser anyway. And not only did her mom think that, but so did Molly's coworkers and her sister. Her sister really didn't like Clay. Apparently, he kind of just gave her the ick, the heebie-jeebies, and Clay was also known to have a temper and have some issues with road rage, things like that, so they just weren't really happy and over the moon about their relationship. But going back to that road rage, it was kind of like if somebody pissed him off while he was driving, he wasn't going to let it slide. He would either lay on his horn, he would flip the person off, he'd sometimes even get out of his car, which that's all pretty bad. But even when Clay wasn't driving around, he also got into fights with people or threatened them. Like how one time, one of Molly's coworkers offered to pay for her and Clay to go out to dinner while they watched the kids. When Molly and Clay got back from dinner, Clay was super pissed off that the neighbors upstairs were making too much noise. So he went up to go yell at them and even went as far as daring them to fight him. Nothing ever came of it because the neighbors didn't want to deal with him. They also didn't take his dare or get into a fight, but still, it was clear that Clay was a hothead with a temper that was pretty difficult to control. So it's not too hard to see why so many people thought that Clay wasn't exactly a catch. He was angry, he didn't have a job, he didn't ever seem particularly interested in getting one. He also had a record. It was mostly theft charges and other minor offenses, but then he also had one very big issue. See, Clay was convicted of assaulting his cousin in a sexual way when she was only 7 years old. Now, the assault had happened before Molly met him, although Clay didn't exactly volunteer the fact that he had done it. It took 7 years for this victim to go to the police and to talk about what the then 16-year-old cousin had done to her when she was just 7 years old. So in 2004, all of those years later, when Clay probably thought that it had all gone away, he learned that he was being charged with aggravated assault. Now, Clay didn't actually know what aggravated assault meant, so he asked one of the detectives investigating the case, and the detective told him that when he assaulted his cousin in that sexual way, he also beat her up badly. And that apparently set Clay off. So he stood up and he said, I didn't beat her up when I her, almost as if it was okay that he did assault her in a sexual way, but he was now claiming he didn't beat her. He admitted it himself, but even with that confession, Molly still felt like Clay was being pressured into taking a guilty plea. She wanted to see the best in Clay. He was the love of her life, and he felt the same about her. So Molly wasn't about to give up on him, even with that kind of background. Now, you would think that Molly would leave Clay as soon as she found out about that kind of disgusting behavior, but she didn't. She stood by Clay's side and planned to stay with him during his 1-month joke of a sentence that was supposed to begin on June 21st, 2004. Which, you heard that right, 1 month. Clay only had to go to prison for 30 days, and then afterward he would be on 10 years probation, which Molly somehow thought was unfair, which I agree that that's not fair, but obviously not in the way that Molly was thinking. She thought it was unfair, like it was too long. And look, Molly loved that Clay loved her for who she was, and I guess because of that, she was going to love him unconditionally as well, which I guess might be hard to understand, but she also had never had a man in her life before who had ever seemed to actually like her this much or love her this much. She wasn't used to feeling special or appreciated, so she probably did feel like she hit the jackpot with Clay, even if he was an offender with a horrible past. Now, of course, that attitude didn't really line up with what everybody else thought. Clay's uncle, who was the victim's father, was absolutely livid about the fact that Clay was only getting a slap on the wrist for what he had done. The uncle wanted him put away for a long, long time. Ideally, forever. But for whatever reason, the state wasn't changing their minds, and Clay was only going to get a month in prison. But then, just a few days before his sentence was about to begin, Clay went missing. It was the morning of June 18th, 2004. Molly got up to go get ready for work and to get the kids ready for the day. That's when she realized that Clay had never made it home the night before. She knew he had gone over to his mom's house, but he wasn't supposed to spend the night there, so he definitely should have been back by now. Now, in other circumstances, you might think, okay, maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he was too tired to come home, so he just fell asleep or caught a nap on his mom's couch. Except he and Molly shared a car. And without a car, Molly wasn't making it to work, which was vital for them. She was the sole breadwinner, and they were already on an extremely tight budget. So it would be a very, very big deal for Clay to not come home with the car, and it also wasn't like him. So when Molly called Clay's mom, she said Clay wasn't there. Molly called her mom, freaking out and crying, saying Clay was missing, and afterwards she called the police to file a missing persons report. Later that morning, Clay's mom, Lori, also called the police. She was worried about where her son could be since she knew he didn't return home. And weirdly enough, it was an extra busy morning for the police that day, because they had also received a call from a guy riding his motorcycle earlier that morning before the sun was even up. While he was on his bike, he saw flames coming from what looked to be a car on fire. And this car was stuck in the embankment on County Road 258 in Leander. County Road 258 wasn't your busy city street either. It's more of a quiet, rural road that winds through the outskirts of Leander. It's the kind of road that doesn't see much traffic, making it a very unlikely spot for any major incidents. So the fact that a car was on fire there, it was pretty shocking to find. When help arrived, the fire was so bad that the police weren't able to even identify what original color the car had been. The tires were also completely melted, meaning that this fire was unusually hot, even for a fire related to a car accident. And on top of all of that, there was a body inside. But the body didn't have a head, legs, or hands. Had they been burned off? Had the body been dismembered before the fire? There was no way to tell. There was basically little to no way to even identify this person because there was no way to check prints, dental records, or anything else. And when it was all said and done, the police had 12 pounds of bones, essentially. There wasn't even any blood or any other kind of fluid in the car, which is very unusual to say the least in a car accident. But the police were able to figure out that the car was Molly and Clay's 1999 Chevy Cavalier. They figured this out due to some of the items in the car and the registration. So by process of elimination, it was assumed to be Clay inside this car. A few of his personal belongings were also in the car, like a Harley-Davidson pin that Clay always wore on his hat, his silver chain necklace, also part of a burnt shoe, and those items were enough for Clay's family to identify the body as his. But the police still had to make sure that all of their T's were crossed, all of their I's were dotted on their paperwork. It wasn't enough to just have the family identify the body. They also needed to get some testing done, and they needed to confirm that this was really him. Among other things, a medical examiner extracted bone marrow from the body's hip bone to send it over for testing to see if that matched his mother's DNA. However, that process was long. It was going to take 6 months for these results to come back in. In the meantime, the police were trying to determine what to rule Clay's death as, accidental or homicide, because there were some really odd things that stood out at the scene of the accident, and the biggest one being that there were no skid marks on the road, which was unheard of. If a car is found on fire in an embankment, it's assumed that this person driving it lost control, which would of course result in skid marks on the road from the tires. But there was nothing. So the police thought that they were looking at a homicide situation. The running theory was that somebody killed Clay beforehand. Then they put his body in the car, and then somehow they crashed it. That would also explain the lack of any blood or other bodily fluids in the car. So this now had them asking, who had killed Clay? Clay's mom, Lori, didn't know who this killer could be, but she did know, even without the DNA evidence and the results back yet, that tragically the body had to be Clay. As much as she would have loved to hold out hope, knowing that he was still alive, she knew that there was no way that some other random person died inside his car the exact same morning that he went missing without a trace. The odds of that happening were just way too far out there to even consider. Molly was absolutely beside herself because now the love of her life had just died suddenly. But life had to go on, which meant that the women now had to plan his funeral. And as we know, funerals are typically very sad, usually proper, toned down to some degree. People are there to grieve and pay their respects to the deceased and to the family. But that wasn't the case at Clay's funeral that following Monday on June the 21st. It had only been 3 days since Clay's body had been found, and if you were to walk into this funeral, you'd almost think that you were at a hole-in-the-wall biker bar on a Friday night. I mean, first of all, there was a literal motorcycle with a Confederate flag draped over it and parked at the front of the room near Clay's casket. Molly and Clay's moms were dressed in black leather biker jackets. There was rock and roll music playing. Almost everybody there was just getting wasted. And this wasn't some small gathering of Clay's family and friends either. I mean, around 200 people showed up. Which, remember what I said earlier about how Clay wasn't well liked and he had a temper? He didn't even have 200 close friends. So it seems more likely that some of these guests were just nosy people who came in because the burning car had been big news in the city. So you can only imagine that with so many people getting drunk at a funeral, things started to get kind of rowdy. And with the drinking came some foul language, especially when it came to Clay's character. In fact, his best friend got up to give his eulogy and said that everybody was just better off with Clay being dead because he was an asshole. The whole funeral was incredibly bizarre, which I'm assuming you've already figured out. Normally in this kind of situation, you might be asking, okay, well, who would want Clay dead? But the issue in this case was that the answer was kind of like everybody. He was known to be a hothead who picked fights, and you all heard that his own best friend, somebody who supposedly, loved him, liked him, said at his funeral that he was an asshole and now everybody was better off. But something that did stick out to the police was that there was one person who had recently been very outspoken about how much they hated Clay. His uncle. I mean, Clay had hurt his daughter. If that's not something that lots of people would be willing to kill over, I don't know what is. And look, plenty of times on this channel, we have talked about disgusting people who either deserved the punishment they got or even more, people who seem more like monsters because of things that they have done, and Clay had assaulted his uncle's 7-year-old daughter. And don't forget, he had badly beaten her too. So if Clay's uncle had it out for him, you can certainly understand why. Except they eventually ruled that the uncle was not a possible suspect, not at all. And without him, the police were running out of leads. They were basically stumped. And they weren't the only ones having a hard time at this point. Now Molly was struggling with her financial situation. I mean, sure, Clay didn't contribute any money to the household as it was since he didn't have a job, but he did watch the kids while she was at work all day. And she couldn't afford to start using daycare now, so she was struggling. Luckily for Molly, the community really did rally for her, Caleb, and Harley. First of all, her job and coworkers stepped up to the plate and they pulled in some donations together and gave her a gift of $1,000. She was able to use that money to pay for some of the day-to-day stuff. Not only that, but the company that she worked for paid for all of her utilities for a couple of months after Clay's death. Her coworkers even went as far as to buy groceries for Molly and the kids and drop them off right at her doorstep, which it was just incredibly generous. And Molly was so thankful to just have this break so that she could focus on her kids and get things back to normal as much as possible for them. But again, when it was time for Molly to get back to work, she knew that she needed childcare, and her monthly income it wasn't going to cut it. So Molly posted a sign in her neighborhood that said, "Newly widowed mother of 2 needs help." And a neighbor named Jenna Pennis saw that sign and felt bad for Molly. Even though she didn't know her personally, she felt like she needed to help. Jenna had a son of her own and felt like if she was in that situation, she would hope that somebody would step up and help her. So she told Molly that she would babysit Caleb and Harley every single week at her house for just $120. Which, if you break that down, that is quite a deal because that's roughly $1.50 per hour per kid. Certainly not the standard rate. Molly wasn't going to find something better than that. So she took this woman up on her offer and felt comfortable going back to work. And once she was back to working a regular schedule, she just dove right in, which kind of came off as strange to everybody that she worked with. Her coworkers didn't really expect Molly to bounce back so quickly. And you might be thinking, okay, well, yeah, some people grieve differently. Some people actually work a lot when they're going through tough times because their jobs can be a distraction or it can help them feel normal. But I don't mean that Molly was just back at work. She was also performing the same way that she always had. She didn't start making mistakes or missing deadlines or do any of the things that you would expect of somebody who was trying to work while they were also dealing with major issues at home. I mean, she did not miss a beat. Molly had been an amazing worker before the accident, and none of that changed now. So things were kind of getting back to normal for Molly and the kids. She had support. She was waiting for Clay's $110,000 life insurance policy check. Luckily, Clay had taken out this big policy on himself 2 years before his accident. So once that was supposed to kick in, things were definitely going to get easier for Molly. I mean, at least financially. She was even starting to feel up for going out with coworkers for dinner beginning a month after the accident. And one night, while she was out with a couple girlfriends from work, she asked them when they thought that it would be appropriate for her to get back into the dating pool again. Her friends tried to be supportive, but truthfully, they did find that it was kind of odd and way too soon. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm not going to pretend that you're not picking up on how suspicious this all was. And I don't want you to think that the police were missing all of this either. They didn't have strong suspicions about Molly necessarily. There wasn't any hard evidence tying her to the murder scene, but they did bring her in for an interrogation just to see if she knew anything. And Molly went into this interrogation like it was any other day and any other kind of interview. She didn't show any strong emotions. She almost seemed cold, which was pretty odd given how fresh Clay's death still was. It's definitely not what you would expect for a woman who just lost her husband all of a sudden. In the meantime, though, Caleb and Harley's babysitter Jenna was actually getting the scoop about what was really going on in Molly's life without even meaning to, without even intentionally trying to get it. See, every time Jenna would go watch the kids, Caleb would go on and on about a man named Jake. He would tell her how fun Jake was. Jake would wrestle with him, go to races with them, and basically he was just the coolest guy ever. So Jenna had to know, who is this mystery guy? Was he just a friend, or was Molly already dating somebody new? But whenever Jenna asked about him, Molly swore up and down that Jake was just a family friend, which, fair enough, you're allowed to have friends. But then Jenna started to doubt that cover story, especially one morning when Molly's car wasn't starting. Molly called Jenna to see if she could come help jumpstart her car. And when Jenna got there and started working on the car, a man came out of Molly's house. That man was Jake, whose full name was Jacob Alexander Gregg. He was only wearing boxer shorts when he stepped outside, which definitely is not exactly an outfit that you wear to somebody's house when you're just a friend, right? So that was when it clicked for Jenna that Jake wasn't some family friend. He was Molly's new boyfriend. Jake had black hair, darker facial hair, and Molly seemed pretty smitten with him. Her younger sister hadn't apparently met Jake yet, and he was always on the road with his truck driving job, so it made it really challenging. But then one time early on in the relationship, she looked at a text conversation on Molly's phone between her and Jake where they said, "I love you." So things were definitely moving fast. This was only a matter of weeks after Clay's death. So moving on, dropping I love yous, I mean, that of course feels like a red flag, doesn't it? Now Caleb especially was getting to be more and more attached to Jake. All he did was talk about him, which he was the only one because no one else knew much about Jake. Molly was staying unusually quiet about her new man. I mean, all she really said was that he was a friend of Clay's that she had met at that same bar where she had met Clay all of those years earlier. So this was all very mysterious. Or maybe not mysterious. Because when I first started researching this case, my assumption was that it was probably obvious. Molly was probably cheating on Clay with Jake, and now that Clay was out of the picture, she could openly date Jake, right? Well, if you think you have this case figured out, trust me, you don't, and you're wrong. So now Molly's kids were growing closer and closer to Jake, even though no one else in her life other than Jenna had met him due to his busy work schedule and always being on the road. As for Jenna, she really didn't think too highly of him. In fact, she thought that he seemed trashy, mainly due to the fact that he would just casually walk out of the house in his boxers and he was inserting himself into Molly and her kids' lives so quickly after Clay's death. But Jenna just figured it was none of her business, so she kept her opinions to herself. Well, then several months went by, And still, no one else got to meet Jake. Molly kept him to herself and then started acting kind of weird. When it came to her work, she was almost like a completely different person. You'll remember how earlier I said that she was usually good at what she did and very on top of things. But now, anytime a coworker would come by her desk, they would notice that she was surfing on the internet. But they couldn't tell what websites she kept visiting, because as soon as they would come by, she would just minimize her screen and basically act all kind of shady and hidden about it. Now, you need to understand that was out of character for Molly. I think we've all had days where work is slow, we sneak a peek at Amazon. For me, I used to go on Perez Hilton back in the day, and I'd look at all my celebrity gossip. So I would get it if somebody walks up and catches you kind of not being productive and not working, so you'll close that window as fast as you can and then pretend you're working, right? On its own, that's not a weird thing to do. It's just that for Molly specifically, it was out of character. She had never been a procrastinator before, and it stood out to her coworkers. Not only was Molly being weird, but her son Caleb was also acting different when he was at Jenna's house as well. So much so that he tried to hurt Jenna's pets. He would also push other kids down the stairs. He was clearly acting out for some reason, and Jenna just could not get through to him. There were timeouts, there were firm talking tos, but nothing was working. And any time that Jenna would mention something to Molly about Caleb, Molly would just shrug it off and say that he acted fine at home, so it was nothing. But Jenna knew it wasn't fine. She couldn't let him run wild in her house, especially because this wasn't just an ordinary temper tantrum. He could potentially hurt somebody else. So whenever he was at her place, she did what she could to discipline him and try to get his behavior under control. But it was hard because she wasn't Caleb's mom. She could only do so much as the babysitter. And if Molly wasn't going to do anything to put a stop to the behavior, it was going to be an uphill battle for Jenna to try to stop it. But here's where things got really cranked up and kind of went up to an 11 in terms of weird, mysterious, bizarre red flags. Molly's sister Melissa came over to visit her. At some point, she had gone to the bathroom to grab something, which was upstairs. But when she got up to the bathroom, she could see into Molly's room, and she noticed a pair of legs that were sticking out of Molly's bedroom closet. And from the looks of the legs, they were a man's bare legs, which weren't moving. So she peered in a little bit, but she only saw a man's lower half. He was wearing boxers, and his head was in the corner, out of sight. So Melissa was obviously freaked out. Molly had never mentioned anything about a man staying over, and also, why would he be sleeping half in and half out of a closet? Was he hiding from her, or was it something else? So she ran downstairs, and she told Molly what she found, but Molly seemed kind of unfazed. She didn't seem to care and was just kind of oh, okay, let me go check it out. So Molly went upstairs for a few minutes, and then she called for Melissa to come and see what it was. When Melissa got up there, Molly explained to her that she had just seen a pair of jeans and shoes sticking out of the closet, not a man. Just some shoes and dirty clothes that were sort of laid out in a way where it looked like legs. But Melissa knew what she had seen, and it wasn't jeans. She saw a man, a three-dimensional man. And she distinctly noticed that he wasn't wearing any pants. It was bare skin that she was not going to get confused with jeans. Come on. So Melissa didn't say much to Molly about it, but she did go to the police with the information. She wasn't quite sure what to make of it, but she figured that if Molly really had nothing to hide, then she wouldn't have told such an obvious lie. Now, by this time, Melissa was pretty sure that the legs had belonged to Jake, but it was weird that he always seemed to be in his boxers whenever anybody talked to him. And that was on top of how now suspicious Molly was being about everything. So when the police got the tip, they definitely thought that it was weird, and let's just say they had been thinking that Molly's whole situation hadn't been adding up for quite a while. At one point, things heated up enough in the investigation that the Texas Rangers were called in to help. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about, they're a more elite version of the Texas police. And the reason they were called in is because when they did that autopsy on Clay, the medical examiner didn't find any soot in his lungs, which kind of supported the original theory that Clay was murdered before that fire even started, and this was no accident at all. Not to mention, the more they looked at the condition of the car and studied the physics of the situation, the more obvious it was that it didn't just accelerate off the road. It must have been pushed from an area higher above the road. However, here's the kicker, for me at least. If a car catches on fire, it usually starts with the gas, either in the tank or because the gas is leaking somewhere else. That makes sense, right? The most flammable part of the car is the part that's going to be burning. Well, when it came to Clay's car, the gas in the tank was not burned. it was still there. So the fire didn't start from any gas in or near the tank. Someone would have had to use a match or a lighter or something else to get this fire going. And the seat that Clay's body was found in was totally saturated with charcoal lighter fluid. So the police even called in an arson investigator who confirmed that the fire could not have been started by accident. Anyways, after the police now got this tip about the man's legs sticking out of the closet from Melissa, they went around to some of Molly's neighbors trying to figure out who this man with the bare legs was. Because at this point, they had no idea that Molly had this new man in her life, not at all. And I guess Melissa didn't want to share her speculation that this guy was Jake, so she just stuck to the facts in her reporting that this was some man and she didn't know who. But Molly's neighbors didn't hold back. They told the police that Molly had a new boyfriend named Jake, and he had moved into her house just a couple of weeks after Clay died. So now Jake became a new suspect. The police thought that there was a good chance that Molly and Jake had started their relationship well before Clay died, and that they conspired together to get rid of Clay so they could be together, exactly at what I hinted at before. The theory now was that Molly had been fed up with Clay, especially after his assault conviction against his cousin. She'd always acted too calm about what he had done, and shockingly so, but maybe she was just hiding the fact that she had this plan to get rid of him, and she was kind of just like biding her time. So the police started looking into Jake, but they weren't finding anything. And in the meantime, things were just getting worse for Jenna when it came to Caleb. So much so that she decided to give Molly an ultimatum. Either she got Caleb some help so that he could deal with his emotions, or she would be done babysitting. In her mind, Caleb was clearly acting out for attention. Maybe it was because he missed his dad, or maybe there was something off about the new guy in his life, Jake. It could have been causing some tension at home. But the thing was that Caleb was still constantly talking about how great Jake was, so none of it made any sense. But either way, something needed to change, or Jenna was not going to be able to keep taking care of Caleb. But again, Molly didn't really seem to care. She was kind of like in La La Land. Then, on December 3rd, 2004, just about 6 months after Clay had died, Molly took a very long lunch break so that she could have a little date with Jake. The two of them went to a Taco Bell in North Austin, and Jake was biting into his burrito right as a police team stormed in this Taco Bell with guns drawn. When Jake saw them, he apparently said, "Oh fuck," and it was for good reason, because the detective looked at Jake and realized he wasn't looking at a man named Jake at all. He was looking at Clay, right dead center in the eyes. The officer asked to see his ID, and Clay, pulled out his license, which had the name Jake Alexander Gregg on it. But the officers knew that this was fake. This was obviously Clay. He looked exactly like him, just as if he had dyed his hair from sandy blonde to black. So when they arrested him, one of the officers said, "Welcome back," kind of like a little joke, since apparently Clay, rose from the dead. Now, in the meantime, Molly was flipping out. She was cussing up and down at the officers, saying she was a grieving widow, they had no right to be doing this to her. She was basically trying to say that this man that they were arresting wasn't Clay, and that he was a completely different person and innocent. And then Molly really went and shot her mouth off, yelling that the police could not arrest her, which was a big mistake, because they were not about to put up with any of Molly's crap, so she was arrested as well. And if you're wondering how the police figured out that Clay was Jake and how they had known that he and Molly would be at that Taco Bell that day, well, 6 months had gone by since the accident, and those DNA results came back from that bone marrow test, and the person in the car was not Clay. So as soon as the police realized Clay was alive, or at least he wasn't that body in the car, they took another look at Molly's life, her life post-accident. And that alone was enough to give them a strong feeling that she and her new boyfriend were up to something nefarious, something weird. They just needed a bit more evidence to piece together what exactly that was, and to figure out why or if they were faking Clay's death. So they started tailing Molly, and they followed her that day to the Taco Bell where she met Clay/Jake for lunch. So at the time of their arrest, Clay was charged with violation of probation for not fulfilling his 30-day sentence for that assault on his cousin. And Molly was charged with hindering apprehension, which is basically when somebody helps somebody else avoid getting caught by the police. So this can mean hiding them, lying to the police, helping them escape, destroying evidence, or warning them about a police search. And as we know, Molly did all of that with Clay. She had him hide in her closet anytime somebody came over who actually knew him, And she also lied about him still being alive, obviously, to everyone. And all along, Molly and Clay had been telling their kids to call him Jake, not Clay. And further, that Jake wasn't actually their dad, which, how twisted is that to do to little kids? After his interrogation, Clay finally admitted that he really was Clay, and that he had dyed his hair black all as a disguise. But when Molly was questioned, she basically played dumb and said she had no idea that Clay had faked his death. According to her, one day, a month after he supposedly died, he just showed up at her front door. And from then on, she just kind of basically went along with everything. She tried to throw him completely under the bus to protect herself. But obviously that didn't make any sense. Meanwhile, Clay told the police his entire plan. Basically, he didn't want to go to prison for the assault charges, and he especially didn't want to be put on the registry or have a record. So basically, he just didn't want to deal with the legal fallout that was going to come from these charges, from being convicted for this kind of crime. The offender status seemed to be the biggest motivating factor for Clay and Molly, and faking his death apparently felt like the best way to get out of it. Molly even gave an interview eventually where she said that if Clay did get put on the registry, quote, "we would lose our house. We were going to have to move. We'd lose a lot of different things that had to do with our kids. He won't be able to be a stay-at-home dad anymore. He wouldn't be able to take the kids to school, pick them up from school." So the two of them figured that he would get his life insurance policy check and they would be able to move the family to Mexico. Not to mention Molly had received all of those donations from people when Clay died. So the plan was that in Mexico, Clay could get face-altering plastic surgery so that nobody would be able to recognize him. Molly also planned to get a tummy tuck as well there too, because I guess that was needed. The plan hadn't gone through yet though, because the insurance company didn't send the check, which I just gotta say, this seems like the wildest, craziest idea to me, right? And you're probably wondering, okay, so it wasn't Clay in the car after all. So who was it? Well, Clay wasn't talking at that point, and Molly was still at this time saying that she had nothing to do with any of it. But while Clay was in prison for the charges of faking his death, while the investigation into everything else was still going on, he ended up telling his cellmate everything. He said that he and Molly had hatched a plan to dig up a grave, remove the body, and that is who was in his car. And as we see so often, that cellmate ended up repeating some of what he had told him. So some detectives asked Molly about what that cellmate said, and she said yes, Clay did dig up a grave in a rural area. She said it was a cemetery that had gas pipelines nearby, so I guess she had figured that the jig was up, but she didn't give an exact location. Well, the police went to a local cemetery that wasn't too far from where that car accident had happened. They wanted to see if any graves looked like they had been recently dug up, and I mean, it had been over 6 months, but at this point, it was really the only lead that they had. So the nearest cemetery was called Pebble Mound Cemetery. And right away, when an officer pulled up and started looking at the graves, he noticed one plot that seemed to be a little bit messed up compared to the others. So the police got in touch with the funeral director to get permission to dig up that plot, to see if the remains were still in the casket or if they had been removed. The funeral director brought over a backhoe, and he and the officers dug for 2 hours until they hit the casket. The seal had been broken, and sure enough, when it was opened, there was no body, just a pillow. This empty grave belonged to 81-year-old Charlotte Davis. She had died 6 months before this car accident on December 20th, 2003. She had spent a good bit of her life in group homes due to being in a wheelchair and also having mental disabilities, but she had been known to always have a smile on her face, and she radiated happiness. But beyond that, there isn't much public information known about her. She lived a pretty quiet life, but I do know that she didn't want to be cremated, which sickeningly enough, Clay and Molly kind of robbed Charlotte of her dying wish because she was burned up in that accident that they staged. Once the police had dug up the empty grave, they searched Molly and Clay's house as well as Molly's work computer. At their house, they found a bunch of records for that fictitious Jake Gregg character, including fake school transcripts, credit reports that they ordered online, the works. And you'll remember Molly was acting very weird at work and minimizing her computer screen anytime a coworker came around. Well, as it turned out, she was actually looking things up like how to fake a death, how to come up with a new identity. Plus, she had also researched how to burn a body, which I almost can't believe that kind of information is just out there for anyone to find. It's bizarre. But there you go. The world is full of some messed up people. Needless to say, there was a ton of evidence to prove that not just Clay was involved, but Molly too. She could deny things all she wanted, but the proof was right there on her hard drive. So it ended up coming out that the two had been planning it for quite some time. They found Charlotte by driving around looking out for different cemeteries, and when they found Pebble Mound Cemetery, they started looking at headstones, looking for ones that matched their specifications. They wanted to find someone who was older, who they thought wouldn't have many visitors, if any, so nobody would notice if the ground had been disturbed or not. And Molly later went on to say, "We felt because she was older, there would not be much family impact, if any." And in another interview, she even said, the body had to be, a certain amount of old. If it was too old, it wouldn't work. If it was too new, it wouldn't work. Too old, it wouldn't probably be feasible to get the body out of the grave. Too new, it wouldn't burn the way that it needed to. It's also important to note that Charlotte was embalmed, and embalming fluid is highly flammable, which it is super disturbing how much thought and research Clay and Molly put into everything. I mean, months and months of research. From finding the cemetery, to then finding the perfect dead person, to then figuring out how to burn the body and get away with it. All of that to just avoid a month of prison time and a criminal record for something that you clearly did, you admitted to. So on the Thursday night, the day before the car was discovered on fire, Clay went to the cemetery alone while Molly stayed home with the kids. Now, there are some sources that said that Molly helped dig up the body and stage the scene, but from my research, most sources say that it was all Clay. He dug up the body, he loaded it into the car, he pushed it down a hill, he doused the body with fuel, then lit the fire. He even purposefully planted some of his own things in the car to make it seem like it was him there, and then he dressed Charlotte's remains in his clothing and shoes. Finally, at the end, he left by hopping on a motorcycle that he and Molly had hidden in a bush beforehand, and he left thinking he just got away with his own murder. And all of that makes sense to me that he did it by himself because they had little kids that would have needed to be watched. And since no one came forward saying that they were babysitting them that morning, I think it's safe to assume that Molly stayed home for this part of it. Not guaranteed, but certainly looks that way. Molly ended up pleading guilty in May of 2005 to the felony charges of insurance fraud and hindering apprehension. She was given the maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. The prosecutor on the case said that what Molly and Clay did was a ghoulish and horrific crime. That's a direct quote. At her sentencing hearing, she cried, and she said it was all about keeping her family together. She swore up and down that it had nothing to do with money, though I do find it hard to believe that the money wasn't a motive at all, given how they had plans for how they were going to spend it and what they were going to do. Not to mention accepting the free childcare, the money that was fundraised for her at work, the free groceries, the utilities, and basically just taking advantage of a lot of different people's generosity. As for Clay, in January 2006, he pleaded guilty to arson and to desecrating a cemetery. He was given 10 years for those charges, but he was also in the middle of serving another 20 years for violating his probation. Which, how ironic is it that he was trying to avoid prison for 30 days and he ended up getting 30 years. And that, my friend, is on karma. So Molly gave an interview about a year and a half into her sentence. In it, she tried to justify what she had done to Charlotte, saying, "Those people out there who are upset with me about it are supposedly God-fearing Christian people, and they need to understand it was just a body. She was in heaven, like they said. She was a good woman who went with God. It was just a body." Okay, can you talk about having no remorse? Then the interviewer asked her if she had any remorse, because it sure didn't seem like she did, and Molly said, "I can tell you that being locked up 13 months has made a great impact on my life, and I don't feel right now. There's a wall up, and I wish people could actually see how I feel on the inside." When she was asked if there was anything that she wanted people to know, she said, "That I care about what I did, that I'm sorry for what I did, that I want to be a good mom, that I can't believe that I did this." Molly also said that she was still fully Team Clay in all of this. She was planning on getting back together with him after both of their sentences are over. Specifically, she said, "I still do love him. He is a good man." She added that she did it all for Clay because, according to her, quote, "I like to fix things. I like to make things better." Well, even though she had talked all of this big game about standing by her man, she definitely didn't wait around for Clay. She legally divorced him while she was still in prison. So Molly ended up being released in 2016 after just 12 years. After a while, she ended up moving to Florida, and apparently she doesn't appear to be in a relationship. So maybe once Clay gets out, she will take him back. She hasn't publicly said anything that makes me think that she came to her senses and realized that he was pretty much garbage, so who knows though. but she seems to have maintained a close relationship with both of her kids, who are now adults, and she even reconciled with her mother, who at one point apparently had cut her off. So everything seems to be back to normal for Molly. Clay is still in prison, though, serving his sentence, and there's no telling when he will get out. The county where Charlotte was buried ended up paying for a new casket for Charlotte so that she could be laid to rest in it, a second time. Now, I can't believe that Molly and Clay got away with things for as long as they did. I mean, they didn't even bother moving or anything like that. They literally just dyed Clay's hair and expected nobody to ever notice. How long did they think that was going to work out? And two young kids, even if you're saying, call him Jake, he's not your dad, how long is it going to take for one of them to spill and say, my daddy Clay, or slip it up, or tell them like, oh, but I'm not supposed to say anything? It just makes no sense. How long did they think that that was going to work? And let's say that the police didn't catch on to them. Weren't they thinking that eventually their parents were going to notice that Jake was actually Clay? Even if he went to Mexico and got all of this elective cosmetic surgery, was he going to hide his real identity from his best friends? His family? He thought no one would notice that he had the same voice, the same personality, the same everything as Clay, other than the way he looked? And I also can't get over the fact again that Caleb, the 4-year-old, was being coached to call Clay Jake and pretend that he was this entirely different person. It's so awful. Molly's sister even talked about it in an interview, saying, what they did to Caleb, convincing him that Jake was not his daddy, that is where my anger comes from. But Molly didn't seem to think that what she was doing really affected Caleb. We know his babysitter was saying that he was acting out, but Molly just tried to brush it off as ordinary 4-year-old behavior. And actually, that was something that stuck with the jury the most. They wanted Molly to have a harsher sentence for what she did to her kids. However, unfortunately, as we've seen time and time again, being a shitty parent isn't always against the law. So maybe it's just me, but it's hard to feel bad for her, and I want to know what you guys think. Did she serve a long enough sentence, and should Clay ever see the light of day? Because again, let's not forget that on top of robbing a grave, he assaulted his child cousin in a sexual way. So my vote is no. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode. It was a wild one. I've got a lot more wild ones on the deck too. So if you haven't hit subscribe yet, hit it now so that you don't miss those. Even if you think you're subscribed, I would suggest hitting it again because like I said, YouTube has been unsubscribing people lately, not just from my channel, but from others. So hit subscribe. And make sure to turn your notification bell to on so that you don't miss any of the new videos. All right, guys, thank you again for tuning in. And until the next one, stay safe. Bye.